Thank you, Rebecca. Next, we have Shanna Merola. She's our new interim heir in photography. She is a visual artist, photojournalist, and legal worker. In addition to her studio practice, Shanna has been a human rights observer during political uprisings across the country, from the struggle for water rights in Detroit and Flint, Michigan, to the front lines of Ferguson, Missouri, and Standing Rock, North Dakota. Her collages and constructed landscapes are informed by these events. Shanna lives in Detroit, where she facilitates Know Your Rights workshops and coordinates legal support for grassroots organizations through the National Lawyers Guild. In the fall of 2018, she led a 4-week art and law seminar as a visiting artist in residence in the photography department here at the Cranbrook Academy of Art. Shanna has been awarded studio residencies and fellowships through the McDowell Colony, Kala Institute of Art, the Virginia Museum of Fine Art, the Midwest Environmental Justice Network. Shanna's collaborative projects include Detroit Resists, a digital occupation of the U.S. Pavilion at the Venice Biennale in 2016, and Oil and Water, or I should say Oil Plus Water, Photography in the Age of Disaster Economies, 2017. She is the recipient of the 2019 Society for Photographic Education's Image Maker Award and a 2019 Puffin Foundation Project Grant. Sorry. Her work has been published and exhibited both nationally and abroad, and she currently has a solo exhibition at Notre Dame University, and it runs through the 27th of September. Please welcome Shanna Merola.
Hello, everyone. Thank you. It's an honor to be here today with my fellow colleagues and all of you, and most importantly, this truly incredible photography department that I have the privilege of spending time with over the next year. So my work lies at the intersection of conceptual art, photojournalism, and the legal system. After graduating from Cranbrook Photo in 2011, I put down roots in Detroit and discovered another kind of education outside of the academy walls through the teachings of Grace Lee Boggs and James Boggs. Grace, a radical activist, worked for decades in the city alongside her husband James and countless civil rights leaders, including Malcolm X and Dr. Martin Luther King. Today, the Boggs Center is an umbrella organization for social justice groups throughout the city. It was also my introduction to the Detroit Coalition Against Police Brutality. In addition to projects like this neighborhood housing board up in Brightmoor, the coalition holds conflict resolution workshops, rallies against police brutality, and when there's time, we hang out with puppies. Here, Ron Scott, co-founder of the Detroit chapter of the Black Panther Party, talks about Detroit history from the steps of the Motown Museum. Ron and Grace both passed away in 2015, but together in their lifetime, they were unrelenting critics of the socioeconomic conditions that contributed to Detroit's decline. Their guidance nurtured generations of activists, touching thousands of lives and inspiring younger generations to pick up the torch. When I met Grace and the beloved community, she was 95 years young. It was the beginning of many conversations, work parties, potlucks, and rallies, which led to the focus of my next project. On July 23, 1967, a confrontation between Detroit police and city residents exploded into a major rebellion. President Lyndon Johnson sent in National Guard, and over the course of 5 days, 47 people were killed. Television crews showed live footage to the rest of the nation as the city burned. In Black Day in July, I integrate archival footage with the present-day area of 12th and Claremont, where the rebellion began. These collages were created and then photographed inside vacant homes still standing on those streets. While working on this series, I conducted interviews with residents who talked about redlining, forced segregation through racialized housing covenants, the terrorist police force stress, and the rise of the Black Power movement. I learned that the Black radical tradition in Detroit includes Marxist union organizers, the Pan-African movement, and the militant anti-imperialist critique of the Black Panther Party, whose deep understanding of symbolism through visual language forever changed the cultural lexicon of resistance. As I worked on this series, I also collected video testimonials from residents about their memories of 1967.
I was 20. I was 20 when the 67 rebellion started. It was a rebellion against the oppression, both in economics, politics, and the military apparatus of the city of Detroit. Detroit Police Department had, for a long period of time, been primarily one of the whitest institutions, one of the most racist institutions around. And so it was not surprising that what ultimately happened was a combination of factors, both in terms of the police department harassing, oppressing, and confronting people. And then in addition to that, the circumstances just surrounding the hope and the aspiration of African Americans in the city of Detroit. In other words, you could work at the plant, make decent money, but you couldn't live where you wanted to live. You could work, make decent money, but you couldn't aspire to higher public office. You could work and make decent money, and you could still be stopped and harassed and maybe killed.
So it was through these interviews that I discovered the National Lawyers Guild, one of the oldest and most extensive networks of human rights activists working within the legal system. In the 1960s, the Guild set up offices in the South and organized thousands of volunteer lawyers to support the civil rights movement long before the federal government stepped in. In 1971, they fought to defend prisoners during the Attica uprising against horrific conditions in a maximum security prison. Guild lawyers represented thousands of anti-war demonstrators and FBI-targeted members of the Black Panther Party and American Indian movement. The Guild's legal values emphasize human rights over property rights and over the rights of corporations. One program within the Guild is to provide legal observers at protests whose primary role is to make sure the civil rights of demonstrators are not violated by police. And in the fall of 2013, I became the legal observer coordinator for the Detroit and Michigan chapter. During that same year, the city filed for the largest municipal bankruptcy in U.S. history. The bankruptcy was carried out under a state-appointed emergency manager who stripped residents of their voting rights and suspended democracy for the entire local government. All of this came on the heels of a historic foreclosure crisis fueled by racially discriminatory predatory lending, which forced hundreds of thousands of residents from the city. Soon after, in the spring of 2014, an aggressive water shutoff campaign was announced for residents overdue on their payments. The unprecedented act of cutting water to 3,000 households per week brought criticism nationally and internationally. News spread quickly, prompting the UN to launch an investigation which declared the shutoffs a human rights violation. During that first summer, community members created a rapid response network for relief through assistance hotlines, water deliveries, and door-to-door canvassing. In addition to creating survival strategies through mutual aid, they also filled city council meetings, called press conferences, and held endless protests for water rights throughout the city. So when I travel and I do this lecture and people aren't as connected as they are here to the issues, I really like to try to drive the point home that all of the help that was coming, all of the aid that was coming in like the first couple weeks and months was due to community like mutual aid and neighbors bringing literal buckets of water over to other neighbors because there were helplines, but they were really bureaucratic and people couldn't get through, and they'd be online. They'd be like trying to get through on the phone for like hours and days, and meanwhile people were living in houses with children and did not have any clean water to give them. So it's been over 5 years since the shutoffs began, leaving some homes without water for months at a stretch, causing illness, displacing residents, and breaking up families. The increasing injustices around water privatization in predominantly Black and brown cities has since been compounded by the tragedy of Flint. In the spring of 2014, a disastrous switch from the Detroit's treated water to the Flint River caused lead to leach into the water supply, exposing elevated levels of heavy metal neurotoxins. Residents were suffering from skin rashes and hair loss for months before the city finally declared a public health emergency. In January of 2015, organizers called a solidarity road trip from Detroit to Flint, bringing the two cities together in the struggle for water rights. At this demonstration, we overheard that prisoners in the Genesee County Jail were being forced to drink and bathe with contaminated water from the tap, and that no official announcement was made inside the jail when a state of emergency was declared to the rest of Flint, leaving inmates to find out word of mouth through visitations. Working with a former jailhouse attorney and prison rights advocates, I visited the jail for 6 weeks. Sitting in the busy waiting room or standing outside in the parking lot, we collected statements from recently released prisoners. But it was our word against the Genesee County Jail officials who insisted that their own testing had revealed only trace amounts of lead. In our desperation, we even ordered test kits and smuggled out bottles of water from the visitor's bathroom sink. Once we had enough evidence and the FOIA request submitted, an injunctive order was filed to get bottles of water to people inside as quickly as possible. The story went national when whistleblower and former inmate Jody Kramer shared his experience with us for this piece on Democracy Now! The interview was conducted by myself, Antonio Cosme of the Raise Up Collective, and Kate Levy.
Well, we turn now to some of the voices of Flint residents who were not heard at yesterday's congressional hearings, the hundreds of prisoners at the Genesee County Jail in Flint. While many Flint residents have been buying bottled water throughout this crisis, inmates at the jail have had no option but to drink and shower in the city water following the switch to the corrosive Flint River more than a year ago. In October, after Flint's newly elected mayor, Karen Weaver, declared a state of emergency over high levels of lead in the city water, the jail briefly switched to distributing bottled water. But 5 days later, the jail switched back to the city supply after the sheriff said a water quality test showed the water was safe. That means the inmates were forced to drink, bathe in, and eat food cooked in the city's contaminated water. Finally, last Friday, the jail again switched to using bottled water.
In this exclusive Democracy Now! Report, we hear the voice of former Genesee County Jail prisoner Jody Kramer. He was just released from jail this week after serving 2 months. While inside Genesee County Jail, Kramer worked as a trustee in the kitchen. He helped distribute food and more recently bottles of water to other prisoners. He says once water distribution began this past Friday, he was instructed to distribute 2 12-ounce bottles of water twice a day to prisoners, or a total of 48 ounces per day. That's less than half the amount of water the Institute for Medicine recommends adult men drink daily. Kramer also says there are a number of pregnant women in the jail and that they too were drinking the tap water up until last Friday's switch. Lead poisoning puts pregnant women at risk for miscarriages, can cause permanent damage to the brain, kidneys, and nervous system of newborn children. Jody Kramer is joined in this interview by his mother, Linda. But first, we start with Jody Kramer.
In jail, we were drinking from the taps. Our food was being made from the taps. Prior to this, they had already started handing out bottles of water when this first broke in October. And then they stopped, saying that their water was good. Many inmates made complaints due to the fact that the deputies would not drink from the faucets. They all carried bottled water. And on that same token, we were consistently told that the water in the jail was good. I had also, when I had made phone calls home, I had explained the situation to my family members. And from what we were told, the water in the jail was good.
So, like I said, when I called down there, I didn't write the deputy's name down. He was just kind of, short. And, I said that I'm concerned my son's in there and I'm concerned about, the water. How's you guys, where's your water come from? And he says, we have filtration process or whatever. And he said, our water's fine. So, and then they started giving you bottled water on January 23rd.
Right. Water was starting to be distributed on the 23rd of January. But the food they still served that day was already made with the water. So we kind of were like, all right, well, we're distributing water, but what about this food that we've been eating all day or all month or prior to this? I was very much concerned that I get 4 bottles of water a day. I have 2 bottles at lunchtime, 2 bottles at dinner time per inmate. Yeah, I have to not only drink this water, but I have to brush my teeth. I drink coffee. We've been told that there's nothing wrong with washing your body or hands with this water out the tap, that it's just consuming it. That's what they've told. There is pregnant women inside Genesee County Jail, several pregnant women inside jail. I know this because there's diet trays that are distributed. They're allowed so much, or they get a double portion because they're pregnant or something. So you see, when you make their tray, you have a list of how many people, and there's a lot of pregnant women in Genesee County Jail. As far as I know, they get the same amount of water as anybody else.
So as the water crisis unfolded across Michigan, I'm going to jump back in time a little bit. Legal observers from Detroit were also dispatched to St. Louis in August of 2014 when Darren Wilson shot 18-year-old Mike Brown, leaving the teenager's body uncovered for 4 hours on the street outside of the Canfield Greens. Over the next few days, activists, reporters, street medics, and legal workers would pour into Ferguson, Missouri. We arrived 6 days after Mike Brown was killed, at which time the suburb had already become highly militarized. On the first night, demonstrations were large, a few thousand people, and decentralized. Here, legal observers stand in front of the remnants of a Quick Trip gas station. Protesters ended up using this space to gather, while a few miles away, on the other end of Florissant, police closed down access to a Target parking lot, using it as a command center for vehicles and armored tanks. For the stretch of miles in between, protesters sang and marched from day into night. Officers were everywhere the protesters were and could often be seen holding weapons on tops of buildings. They looked like this during the day and wore riot and tactical gear at night. Undercovers walked through the crowd, sometimes following people back to their homes or to churches that had become organizing hubs. On the second night, a curfew was enforced and residents were threatened with arrest, chemical weapons, and canine units. And local police threatened journalists with physical violence for trying to report the story. But the state response only seemed to galvanize hundreds of thousands of protesters who would travel to Ferguson in the months to come for mass mobilizations of civil disobedience. In a similar fashion, private security working with police in North Dakota violently attacked demonstrators and investigative reporter Amy Goodman on September 3rd near the site of DAPL construction. As word of the resistance at Standing Rock grew, over 300 tribes and 4,000 pipeline resistors flooded into the camp that fall. I traveled to North Dakota to provide legal support for the Indigenous-led uprising in November of 2016. On the day I arrived, North Dakota police fired water cannons, concussion grenades, and rubber bullets into a crowd of unarmed water protectors who were holding a prayer ceremony near the site of DAPL drilling. The standoff lasted over 5 hours in freezing temperatures of 26 degrees Fahrenheit. A team of street medics coordinated life-saving measures to mitigate injuries and drove others to the closest hospital nearly an hour away. For the remainder of my time at camp, I worked under the direction of Water Protector Legal, a coalition of attorneys from around the country led by Indigenous women. They created a comprehensive system of jail support to raise bail, get people out of jail, bring them back to camp, and fight hundreds of charges. Meanwhile, the communications of water protectors were under constant surveillance. Months later, a series of Intercept articles would investigate leaked information on Tiger Swan, a private mercenary security firm with ties to Blackwater. Tiger Swan targeted the movement at Standing Rock with military-style counterterrorism measures, collaborating closely with police in at least 5 states. The shocking covert operations that mimic COINTELPRO tactics uncover a rising trend in the surveillance of activists fighting big oil. So I'm going to talk about a couple of collaborative projects that I worked on that are sort of connected to both my photojournalism practice and also my studio practice. In the fall of 2017, I worked again with filmmaker Kate Levy on a collaboration called Oil and Water. Combining my legal documentation over the years with her photographs of the fallout post-Flint, Katrina, and the Bakken Shale fracking boom, we began to make connections between power structures and pipeline routes. Through an investigation on the cause and effect of disaster economies, the work alludes to post-industrial landscapes marked by environmental catastrophe, surveillance, political unrest, and increased militarization. It also highlights direct actions and the resistance work of frontline communities fighting back. An exhibition of the work was up last year in Toledo at Sculpture X, and a part of a symposium where I got to meet some of my heroes like Mel Chin, and it was really a great experience. It's supposed to be a book someday, so we'll see if that happens. In another collaboration in 2016, I worked with Detroit Resists, a coalition of architects, artists, and community members working on behalf of an inclusive, equitable, and democratic city. We came together to respond to the architectural imagination, an exhibition at the 2016 Venice Biennale's U.S. Pavilion. I'm just going to read our statement. So the architectural imagination appropriates contemporary Detroit as a place for visionary American architectural practices to develop new speculative projects with far-reaching applications for cities around the world. Detroit Resists understands the city differently. We know Detroit as a place where African, Indigenous, and activist art communities have been building resilience through culturally literate design, creating space for Detroiters historically and systematically omitted from conventional architecture's imaginings. The digital occupation of the U.S. Pavilion uplifts the rich legacy of grassroots design-based activism in Detroit. This is resistance to mass water shutoffs, mass foreclosures, mass evictions, unconstrained gentrification, and other examples of spatial racism. These dynamics are playing out in cities across the globe in distinct but related ways. We invite you to join us in resistance. It ended up being, in addition to the guerrilla occupation, it was also a zine. So for the last collaboration I want to talk about, I traveled to the Altgeld Gardens on the south side of Chicago to work with a People for a Community Recovery, founded by Hazel M. Johnson. For decades, Johnson and her daughter Cheryl organized against the unregulated industry surrounding Alkeld, one of the highest concentrations of hazardous waste sites in the nation. At one time, the community was surrounded by 50 landfills and 250 leaking underground storage tanks. The following short was produced by filmmaker Kate Levy, cultural producer Bryce Detroit, and myself, with funding through the Midwest Environmental Justice Network.
That is a road that just go take and just sit on the rocks and just look at the river and just serenity, just peace, you know. Been living out here since I was 1 year old.
What? Jungle life. Oh, they claim in statistics to blame it on ballistics. Then they make statistics say my ninja's ballistic.
Most of the people names that's up here on this wall is really related to health-related issues, dying from cancer or asthma. Got no Haywood Lockett, he had cancer. James Solomon Sturz, Pinky, Andre Walker, I know all them folks. Diane Strug, she had cancer. Larry Scruggs had cancer. There goes another black brother.
Incinerators rotten like them politicians. Got us thinking asthma is common, but what's more common? Environmental problems. Narratively flip it, so whip it like that topping. PCR, we invented this. Introduced grammar, got them on our tippy tip. Tip of the brick, the scale, how our movement hit. Deep impact on our Morgan Freeman-ish. Justice for environment, we grinded, no retirement. Hazel Johnson passed the torch, we keep that fire lit. And our crew lit, you can call us fire stick. Watch people for community recover this.
One of their first environmental victory that my mother had.
It was over 500 of us protesting the landfill.
They blocked the entrance to this landfill.
Back in 87, I think it was.
Where they turned around 57 dump trucks within 2 to 3 hours.
Then the next thing that we did.
The city was in serious violations of the Clean Air Act.
We protest against CWM incinerator.
And the community came together to shut down this operation.
United we stand, divided we fall.
This was a winner. So I think power is developed collectively. Every body of water flows to another body of water.
Again, so my collaborators were on this project, Bryce Detroit, Kate Levy, and former collaborations with Antonio Cosme. We worked on the Flint Jail project together. You know, I feel like I've grown so much as an artist because of them, and I'm also really excited to be introducing the photo department to some of these folks over the next year. So my studio practice. While much of my work stems from photojournalism, I also have a studio art practice that's informed by my research in the field. In the series We All Live Downwind, I combine internet images with my own photos, from trips to US Superfund sites to create handmade collages. The originals are printed, turned into temporary sculptures, placed into the landscape, and rephotographed. Using the internet as an archive, I search for the effects of dioxin, cadmium, lead, etc. What happens over time when the human body is exposed to these elements, and what happens to the land? Aerial views of fracking fields show devastated landscapes carved into the earth like veins. I'll make correlations between these topographies and surgery, sometimes including medical equipment or worker-related injuries. Often there's a chaotic violence to the scenes which reference disaster, the extraction of resources, and bodies for exchange in the global market, as well as industrial legacies that disproportionately affect predominantly POC neighborhoods. In The Shock Doctrine, Naomi Klein writes about the free market-driven exploitation of disaster-shocked people in countries, saying the original disaster, the coup, the terrorist attack, the market meltdown, the war, the tsunami, the hurricane, puts the entire population into a state of collective shock, and that shocked societies often give up things they would otherwise fiercely protect. The scenes in We All Live Downwind have been carved out of dystopian landscapes in the aftermath of these events. On the surface, rubble hints at layers of oil and shale cracked and bubbling from the earth below. Rising from another mound, rows of empty mobile homes bake beneath the summer sun, the bust of small towns left dry in the aftermath of supply and demand. In this place, only fragments of people remain, their mechanical gestures left tending to the chaos on auto. Reduced to survival, their struggle against an increasingly hostile environment goes unnoticed. Beyond the upheaval of production, a bending highway promises never-ending expansion, and that low rumble you hear to the west is getting louder. So that's where I usually end my artist lecture. I would like to share a few new images that I haven't really showed anyone from a very new series that I began earlier this year at a residency at Cal Art Institute in the Bay Area. My new series, Nuclear Winter, is an investigation into the inception of atomic testing in North America, its relationship to the rise of brutalist architecture, and ties to Cold War anxiety. Initially born out of post-war austerity, brutalism can conjure a sense of utopia, survival, surveillance, and control. In the United States, it rose to popularity during the same time as the bomb shelter and was strongly aligned with the fear of nuclear attack. So I'm not sure where this is actually going, but I've just inherited a working military surplus World War II era Geiger counter, and am attempting to gain clearance to visit the Enrico Fermi Nuclear Station in Monroe County, Michigan. I've also watched the HBO miniseries Chernobyl twice the entire way through. If anyone else has thoughts or ideas, wants to chat about nuclear disaster, come by and see me in the HQ. Thank you.